Professor Ferguson is a very, very eminent and impressive scientist. I think that he took the right decision.
You wouldn't have...
To resign, that is.
Yeah, you wouldn't have fought to keep him.
That's just not possible in these circumstances.
The Health Secretary was very clear then, but is today any different? Good evening. In the biggest public health crisis in living memory, the Health Secretary broke part of the guidance that it was his specific job to create, to communicate and then to persuade the British public to abide by. That is unarguable. When Neil Ferguson, a voluntary advisor to government, an advisor, was caught breaking similar guidance, Mr Hancock himself said he was left speechless and it was just not possible for him to stay. But there are further questions. Mr Hancock has what would appear to be a rather close relationship with a person appointed to a paid position at his department. Indeed, Gina Coladangelo sits on the board overseeing the department and attended meetings with him discussing lessons learnt from COVID and the performance and risks of a department that's already been found to have broken the law over its disclosure of emergency contracts during the pandemic. The Prime Minister today made it clear he's standing by Mr Hancock after the Health Secretary apologised for breaking guidance. But critics are demanding a full investigation. So tonight we ask, where does all of this leave Mr Hancock's future? And most importantly, where does this leave the government's authority over increasingly tricky demands of a now well-vaccinated public to continue with social restrictions? Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
We know that close contact is how this disease is passed on.
Always stay 2 meters away from people you don't live with.
Every time you try to flex the rules, that could be fatal.
Do as I say, not as I do. Is there a more dangerous maxim in politics? Matt Hancock is about to find out. Throughout the pandemic, there has been no one who has been a more fierce, perhaps more aggressive advocate of the lockdown guidance and legal standing than he.
You asked about hugging people. When people have had both jabs, then that is pretty safe.
Right.
But
Okay.
you shouldn't still spend a lot of time in close proximity. You should make sure ventilation's good. We all know what we can do and take personal responsibility of.
And yet here is the same Matt Hancock on May the 10th in his office at the Department of Health, very much not social distancing, in the grip of his aide, Gina Coladangelo, at a time where you weren't even supposed to hug a relative at a funeral. And other ministers said that this was a private matter.
He does have my support. This is a personal matter. I understand that he hasn't broken any of the rules.
But is it really just a personal or private matter? Leave aside the charge of hypocrisy, of which there is no doubt. Leave aside the question of breaking guidance, which Mr Hancock accepts. Leave aside the fact that private matters in this strange age of ours have been public matters. The question is whether Mr Hancock has broken the law, not just the guidance, statutory instruments issued in his own name as Secretary of State for Health.
The rules in place at the time were the Step 2 rules at the beginning of May. And that meant that nobody could meet indoors with another person unless they fell within one of the exceptions. And the only exception I could think of potentially applying is that what they were doing was reasonably necessary for work. But it's very hard to understand how what we see in the pictures from the Sun could have been reasonably necessary for work. It looked like an entirely private matter.
And even before today, there were questions about the employment of Ms Coladangelo, an old university friend of the Health Secretary.
We met at the student radio station, Oxygen FM. I read the news and Matt read the sport. I've always joked with him that he did the sport because he wasn't good enough to do the news.
She was initially appointed as an unpaid advisor, and then after Mr Hancock appointed her to the board of the Department of Health, a board which is supposed to oversee the department, which Mr Hancock heads, receives a £15,000 taxpayer stipend in the process.
It's a matter of propriety and it's a matter of transparency. There are codes of conduct about special advisors, civil servants, ministers, and also about non-executive directors. And we know that she then became a non-executive director at the Department of Health, so she would have had to have signed up to conflicts of interest. This exposes another question that's not really been tackled in British politics, which is what kind of a conflict of interest, a personal relationship, brings to a role like this, because that kind of influence over the minister, access to the minister, that could affect how officials treat them, how the power balance works in that relationship.
Then there are questions about Mr Hancock's wider credibility and relationship with the truth. He has claimed to have put a protective ring around care homes, something denied by every player in the sector, something Dominic Cummings, then advisor to the Prime Minister, has said was completely untrue.
The Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly.
He has also claimed that there was no national PPE shortage and that the National Audit Office has explicitly confirmed this, but they have not. Comparisons have been made all day between this episode and Dominic Cummings' rather ill-starred escapade to Barnard Castle, but here is a very big difference. Outside of this place, SW1, Dominic Cummings was largely unknown. The same cannot be said for Matt Hancock, who has been one of the principal faces of the government's response to the pandemic and has achieved an unusual level of notoriety and fame even for a health secretary. Conservative MPs will therefore worry that the potential for political damage is still greater, and public health experts will worry that his personal credibility in delivering public health messaging for the remainder of the pandemic has now gone. And then another question, not for Mr Hancock, but for the Prime Minister, lingering over his government whispered in Whitehall. What now is the threshold for ministerial resignation? And what does that mean for standards in our public life?
Lewis Goodall there. Now, we did ask the government for a minister to speak to us tonight, but they declined. We also tried for backbenchers to defend the Health Secretary. Again, no one was available. Instead, we're joined by the chair of the Labour Party, Annalise Dodds, and Professor Stephen Riker, a behavioural scientist from the University of St Andrews. He serves on the government's Spy B board. Now, first to you, Annalise Dodds. The Health Secretary has apologised. Is that not the end of the matter?
Sadly, it can't be the end of the matter, because not only yet again do we see here a senior Conservative behaving like the rules simply don't apply to him, but there are those really big questions about appointments here. Why we have a situation that an advisor who obviously had a very close link to the Health Secretary was also then appointed effectively to challenge his work. This simply is a mess, cronyism on cronyism. And frankly, if the Health Secretary himself will not resign, then the Prime Minister should remove him.
So are you alleging here that Matt Hancock, I mean, he says he didn't break the guidance. Are you suggesting that there's some sort of legal issue?
Well, I think many people looking at the Health Secretary's words here will really be scratching their heads, and they will be thinking through what they themselves have done over these months, when we've seen grandparents not able to cuddle their grandkids, people in care homes having to just look at their relatives through the window, not able to even see them in person. Now, people have been following those rules, whether we call them guidance, rules, prescriptions. Everyone's known what they were, not least the Health Secretary himself. After all, he's been promoting them night after night in the media, and indeed he's been promoting them in Parliament. So there's no excuse here, and it's absolutely critical at this stage that people can have trust in what they're being asked to do. This is a really important stage of the pandemic, And it's the time when this health secretary should stand down. And if he won't, as I said, the Prime Minister must get a grip on this and remove him.
But you'd acknowledge that ministers, shadow ministers, have the right to a personal life, a private life?
Absolutely. And I frankly could not care less about what people do in their private lives. That's not what's at stake here. What is at stake here is the use and misuse of taxpayers' money, whether appointment standards have been followed and whether those rules and regulations have been followed by senior Conservatives in the way that everyone else in the country has been following them. It just feels like there's one rule, frankly, if you're a senior Conservative, and a very different rule for everybody else, and that's not on. But
I put it to you that you've tried to throw mud against the government over a series of issues. When push comes to shove in the local elections in Hartlepool, voters have noticed not that, they've noticed the fact that our vaccination programme has been world-beating. That's what they ultimately care about when push comes to shove.
Well, look, I'm absolutely delighted at the success of that vaccination programme. And I couldn't pay enough tribute to those who've been delivering the vaccine, to the thousands of volunteers, the GPs, the nurses. And frankly, this is about something much, much bigger than whether one party might be up in the polls or down in the polls and what's happening in elections. This is about our country getting out of this crisis, the worst public health crisis in living memory.
Well, it's the vaccinations run by his department that are getting us out of the crisis.
I'm so sorry, could you say that
again?
again?
The vaccinations run by his department that are getting us out of the crisis.
Well, I'm afraid that what I see up and down the country, and I've been to a number of vaccination centres, is not actually government ministers delivering that vaccine into people's arms. It's hard-working nurses, doctors and volunteers. And actually, funnily enough, I was speaking with some of those nurses from my local area this morning, and they were very clear that they feel that they've been succeeding in this very often in spite of the Conservative government, rather than necessarily with its backing.
Well, let's bring in Professor Riker. You advise the government on behavioural responses. What is the evidence for the mass public response to stories like this about senior government ministers or advisors not necessarily taking their own advice?
The evidence is very clear, and I think we only have to look back to the Cummings affair. The thing about this Cummings affair which made it truly toxic was not what Dominic Cummings did himself. It was when the Prime Minister defended him, and therefore an individual indiscretion turned into a systemic issue, a sense of there's one rule for us and another rule for them. And so for me, the Hancock affair changed when, again, the Prime Minister rode in and defended him, again giving rise to that sense of if you are one of the government, an advisor, a minister, you're treated in one way, but the rest of us are treated differently. And once you have a sense of them and us, it critically undermines trust. You have a sense of the government as not looking after us, not on our side, but as other, as imposing upon us. And in the week or two after the Cummings affair, trust in government plummeted so much that the pollsters were shaking their heads and wondering if they got it wrong. It plummeted by about 20% in a week. It went down from nearly 80% to around 30%. Now, you might argue there is so little trust now, there's little more to squander. But nonetheless, in the midst of a huge national crisis, we want a government we trust, and we want a government that we're going to listen to.
And right now, Professor Riker, it is a very sensitive time, isn't it? Because many in the public may be beginning to tire of some of these restrictions, wondering why they have to do them. Some of them have had 2 vaccinations. I don't know, anecdote from the football on Tuesday was that I heard football fans booing the suggestions that we should all wear masks. Public patience may be wearing thin. Do you think this makes this situation even more tense?
Well, let me give you a very concrete example. One of the critical things, as Matt Hancock himself tells us, in terms of the spread of infection, and remember that while the vaccinations are going very well, still less than half of the whole population is infected. There are still some 20 million adults who aren't infected. who aren't vaccinated, fully vaccinated yet. So our behaviour matters. The numbers of contacts we have with others is critical. Now, before the pandemic, we on average had about 11 contacts in a week. Now it's down to about 4. If it went back up to 11, then the second wave would be huge and we'd be in even deeper trouble than we are now. So you need a government and you need a health secretary who can persuade people that it's important for us to limit our contacts for our own safety. Now, the question is, can Matt Hancock do his job, do that job? He might stay in office, but can he do his job? And I think it is fatally compromised in a situation where he does not seem to abide by the evidence that he wants us to follow, and which is critical to our safety and making sure that this third wave isn't much bigger than we fear.
Let me bring Annalise Dodds back in. I mean, some would argue the opposition has given a blank cheque to the health department in terms of the restrictions. You may have to approve a further extension of restrictions. Have you really been holding this health secretary and this health department to account on these crucial issues?
Well, absolutely. And on a number of occasions, we've argued, for example, that the government should have imposed restrictions much sooner. If we had indeed had the kind of circuit break that was imposed in Labour-run Wales, then we could have been in a very different situation going into the winter. Of course, we've also consistently said that the Health Secretary and indeed the Chancellor have to get a grip on self-isolation. That's been a failing of this government since the very beginning of the pandemic, one which indeed SAGE itself, as that expert body, has highlighted. So we have been critical when we've needed to get our country to a better place. Of course, when the government has done the right thing, we've supported them. We are in the middle of a national crisis, but when they've done the wrong thing or they haven't acted, we've pointed that out very strongly indeed.
Must leave that there. Thanks for joining us, Annalise Dodds and Professor Stephen Riker. Much to discuss in a moment with our political panel, but first, what is the impact on government of events such as this? Certainly, public attitudes to the personal lives of public figures has changed significantly since the moral panics over standards in, say, the major government. Similar episodes over the past few months have largely been swamped by the positive polling impact of, for example, the vaccine rollout. So have the rules changed? Here's Ben Chu.
In the past, political scandals involving allegations of sexual or financial impropriety or a potential breach of ethics were considered to be electoral poison, requiring urgent remedial action. But not, apparently, for this government. Since the 2019 general election, not only have there been no ministerial resignations for such behaviour, but a string of controversies have not dented the Conservatives' poll lead over Labour. There was Dominic Cummings' notorious trip to Barnard Castle during lockdown. Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick has faced questions over his approval of a property development of Tory donor Richard Desmond. There have been a host of stories alleging cronyism and potential conflicts of interest in medical equipment procurement. Among them, revelations of Matt Hancock's pub-owning friend winning a lucrative contract. There have been claims of an expensive refurbishment of Downing Street being secretly funded by Tory donors. There have been investigations into the relationship between Mr Johnson and the US businesswoman Jennifer Arcuri, and personal lobbying of the Prime Minister by James Dyson over tax. In all these cases, the government denies impropriety. Nevertheless, none of these stories have apparently moved the national voting intentions dial. So what's going on?
If the COVID crisis were going extremely badly, if it were perceived to be a disaster in public opinion terms, then I think a scandal like this would be potentially fatal for Matt Hancock. The fact that it's perceived to be going well, the fact that the vaccine rollout, for example, is perceived to be a big success, these provide a great deal of cover, armour, if you will, for Matt Hancock.
The question is whether we're in a new political world, where the old rules no longer apply, or whether it's just a matter of time before political gravity kicks in.
The cumulative effect of these things could have an impact once people are not so consumed by thoughts about COVID and short-term health concerns and start to think about other things. The government is in a very privileged position with regards to the protection that the performance of COVID provides. That will not last forever, and they cannot take it for granted.
If this is right, ministers may want to consider, if not check, their COVID privilege.
Now we're joined in the studio by the Whitehall correspondent for the Sunday Times, Gabriel Pogrund, the man who got the scoop, Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun, and Aisha Hazarika from Times Radio. Well, to all of you, can Matt Hancock, the question you saw raised there by Stephen Riker, can he sort of stand up at the press conference podium in this delicate time, really communicate with the British public and tell them perhaps some extension of restrictions is required at this moment? Gabriel, I'll bring you in first.
I mean, in a way, it's quite merciful timing that Harry's monster scoop has arrived just as we are phasing out of restrictions. It's, I think, the 19th of July that, subject to review, we are likely to be released from all of the social distancing requirements of the last year and a half. I think it is unlikely that Hancock will have that same moral authority or credibility in demanding action from the British public, and it's probably just as well that the vaccination programme continues apace. In a different world, the implications of his authority having evaporated in this way might have been more serious.
Aisha, what's your take on this?
I think it's a huge matter of trust. As was said in the package, one of the things that people are really feeling now is that it has been one rule for them and one rule for other people. And when you think of the lengths that really senior people in public life and all of us went to stick to the rules, you remember the Queen at the funeral of Prince Philip sitting by herself. I'm sure people would have given her dispensation to have had other people with her, but no, she stuck to the rules. And our health secretary couldn't even stick to the rules and ended up snogging somebody in the office. And the other thing is, a special advisor in government, and I had lunch today with another special advisor who had been an advisor in government. We're just flabbergasted that you could find the time in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of a global pandemic, the worst pandemic in recent living memory, to have these shenanigans. I mean, it is pretty jaw-dropping.
And Harry, I mean, how does Matt Hancock say you can't go on holiday, you've got to quarantine, wear masks? How does he even use the phrase hands, face and space again?
Yeah, you could arguably say his credibility is totally shot, but I think Gabriel is correct to say if this has been happening perhaps in January at the height of lockdown, it'd be a very different level of public anger, I think. But that public anger is there. However, for us, I think this story it's not just about lockdown, though. There are three elements, I think, to this story, and three elements that Matt Hancock needs to address. Firstly, the ministerial code very clearly states that working relationships with anyone in your department must be, quote, proper and appropriate. And ministers must ensure that there is no conflict of interest between your private life and your personal life, or crucially, that no appearance of a conflict of interest. And so on that, I just don't understand how this could possibly, Matt Hancock can possibly say, this is matter, case closed, and sorry, we'll move on. Then obviously we have the lockdown issue concerning, his credibility. Can he be the poster boy for further restrictions when he has a particularly fragrant approach to social distancing in the workplace himself? And then thirdly, as Gabriel has been thinking around a lot late last year, is how did this person come to be working for Matt Hancock? What was the proper process around her recruitment? An old university friend who's been given a taxpayer-funded contract with absolutely zero detail today from Number 10 or from Department of Health around the probaties of that. So I really don't think this is going to go away. And I don't think burying our heads in sand and saying simply, I'm getting on with the day job is going to be enough. And if I may just quickly say, it was very much a team effort on the scoop. There's some brilliant colleagues at The Sun who battled very hard yesterday to get that one over the line.
Well, that's clarified. But is this like a holding pattern from Number 10? I mean, they didn't firmly deny the suggestion put at the briefing today that the law might have been broken, and yet we've got no sense at all of there being even an investigation into the ministerial code being broken?
No, Lord Guy, the independent advisor on the ministerial activities, is poised, ready to go, but no suggestion that Boris Johnson will be referring this to him.
That's important, isn't it? Because it's Boris Johnson that has. There was a notion that the independent advisor could start his own investigations, but that's not possible. It's entirely on the Prime Minister to fire the gun on any investigation into ministerial standards.
As I understand it, yeah, but the political pressure doesn't seem to be there yet. I'd be interested to see what happens over the weekend, what happens over the next few days, as MPs' post boxes and emails accounts start to fill up. Will there be that same Tory backlash, like in May last year around the Dominic Cummings Barnard Castle scandal, that you started to see Tory MPs putting their heads above the parapet and calling for Cummings then to go? It's all what happens in the next 48 hours. But listening to talk radio stations and certainly my email inbox and our letters page, our letters email today, that public anger is bubbling up. And I do think that the government might be a little bit tin-eared on this one.
Gabriel, let's just dig down to this issue of what happens within that department. Gina Coladangelo is a non-executive director in Department of Health, appointed essentially by Matt Hancock, but whose formal role is to sort of hold to account what goes on in the department.
Yes. I mean, as it happens, Gina Coladangelo had at least two roles in relation to the Department of Health and Social Care. At the start of the pandemic, she was secretly, without any transparency at all, parachuted into the heart of Whitehall as a media and communications advisor to Hancock.
Okay, and the government would argue it was an emergency, all hands on deck, we need to get whatever talent we can to help with an emergency.
That's quite right. The second, as you note, she was this non-executive director, which effectively means she's paid £15,000 a year to scrutinise what it is that the department does. Now, Peter Riddle, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, actually wrote to Lord Evans, who's the chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, last year in order to say there are no rules, there is no process, there is literally no blueprint whatsoever for the appointment of these people who are entrusted with overseeing the functioning and machinery of government, which, he said, is why over the last couple of years we've seen this growing trend of ministers appointing their friends, their alleged cronies and allies to departments who are simultaneously there to sort of be ambassadors of theirs in the departments, to spearhead reforms of theirs, and it is claimed to make sure that the department is being run with probity, and that seems to be...
No serious FTSE 100 company would allow the appointment of a friend like this to their board, because it's the people on the board that hold you to account, particularly when there are clear issues around, for example, the loss of court cases, around the procurement of some of those emergency... there are reasons the government put for some of those developments, but there are issues. You'd expect a non-executive director to hold a Secretary of State to account. Okay, so is there a general issue here of accountability?
That's right. I mean, I just want to say that, Harry's scoop has made this so difficult for the government to ignore, but let's say it hadn't happened. It still remains the case that Matt Hancock and Gina Coladangelo went to Oxford together. They met on student radio. She's spoken, in fact, to the BBC about their friendship at Oxford, how he mischievously lied about not turning up to a rugby game at Twickenham to cover it for a student paper. They're literally, they're close friends. Their families meet. They've, socialised over the years. I mean, the notion that she could possibly scrutinise him is obviously for the birds.
Let me bring in Aisha. It does seem as if, I remember after the Cummings affair, we got a fairly immediate backlash, as I recall, from MPs on social media against him. But we've had radio silence. I mean, no one coming on this show. Radio silence from Tory MPs tonight.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm certainly picking up from people that, behind the scenes, that there is a lot of disquiet because, as Harry said, it's going to be interesting to see what the next couple of days bring. And I think we are at the stage where, we are coming out of this, but people are actually still really angry about the fact that they have been under so many restrictions. And the point that Gabriel makes is an interesting one as well. The kind of other sort of subcurrent in this is this story about cronyism. There's reports out that this woman's brother also won quite lucrative contracts from the NHS. So there is a piece of work that needs to be looked at there. But I think as well the public, I'm not saying this is going to bring the government down, because we know that the Prime Minister has said this is all absolutely fine, probably because of his own indiscretions as well. But a lot of the public do look and think, where is the honour in politics, and what do you have to do to resign these days? I mean, it feels like you could take somebody hostage and you wouldn't have to resign.
On that happy note, we must leave it. We didn't even get to ask Harry about his CCTV sourcing and his photo collection, and whether there'll be more photos to emerge over the weekend, but I'm sure we'll find that out in due course. Well, that's all from us tonight. Emily will be back on Monday at the normal time of 10:30. Enjoy Glastonbury Revisited tonight, but goodbye.